The mother, who's a flamboyant California biker with an affinity for who bravely raises her little son, Rocky, a little boy with a rare disease that eventually distorts his face into a cruel mask of deformity.
Before Hollywood ever heard the name Rocky Dennis, there was a little boy in California whose future had already been decided by doctors. His mother, Rusty Dennis, was told her son had a rare disease that would change everything. The doctors believed he would lose his sight, suffer serious problems, and die while still very young. But Rocky did something nobody expected. He kept growing, kept learning, and most importantly, kept living as if the world had never told him he was supposed to give up. Roy Lee Rocky Dennis was born on December 4, 1961, in Glendora, California. His mother was Florence Rusty Tullis, a woman who was already far from what most people would call a traditional parent. Rusty had grown up in Brooklyn and lived an unusual life before Rocky was born. She was tough, independent, and comfortable around people who lived outside normal society. Later, she became part of a motorcycle group, and that world would become an important part of Rocky's childhood. As a baby, Rocky had health problems that seemed ordinary at first. He suffered from ear and sinus infections. Then, when he was around 2 years old, he went in for a tonsillectomy. During an X-ray, medical workers noticed something unusual about his skull. What followed was months of medical visits and testing. Eventually, Rocky was diagnosed with craniodiaphyseal dysplasia, an extremely rare bone disorder that caused abnormal bone growth in his skull. As the bones became thicker, they put pressure on important parts of his head, affecting his vision, hearing, and other aspects of his health. Doctors gave Rusty a grim prediction. They believed Rocky might become blind, suffer major developmental problems, and die before reaching the age of 7. Most parents would have been crushed by those words. They might have begun preparing for the worst. Rusty chose a different path. She refused to let the diagnosis become Rocky's identity. That didn't mean she ignored his condition. Rocky had real medical problems, but she didn't want teachers, doctors, or other adults to look at her son and see only a sick child. She wanted them to see Rocky. According to the available accounts, doctors believed Rocky's eyesight was too poor for normal reading, and schools tried to move him away from mainstream classes. Rusty fought those decisions. She believed Rocky was intelligent and capable, and she didn't want other people's fear or discomfort to decide what he could do, and Rocky gave her reasons to keep fighting. He was developing a personality that made people remember him. Rocky was known for his humor and warmth. People who met him saw a teenager who could make friends, joke with people, learn, and enjoy life. The most powerful part of Rocky's story was never just the disease. It was the way he refused to let the disease control every part of his life. Rusty believed strongly that a person could influence their own health through attitude and determination. When Rocky suffered from headaches, she would sometimes send him to his room and tell him to make himself well. To some people, that attitude might sound inspiring. To others, it might sound harsh. But Rocky seemed to benefit from one thing she gave him more than anything else: the belief that he was not helpless. Rusty didn't want Rocky to spend his entire life thinking about what he couldn't do. Instead, she pushed him toward what he could do. The people around Rocky also played a major role. Rusty was connected to a motorcycle community, and the people in that world became part of Rocky's life. They treated Rocky as one of their own. This is one of the places where the real story becomes very different from the simple version many people remember. When audiences later watched the movie Mask, they saw a dramatic Hollywood version of Rocky's life. They saw a young boy facing a rare disease, a strong mother, and a group of people who helped him live with confidence. But real life doesn't fit neatly into 2 hours. There were years of experiences that couldn't all be shown. Family members, personal problems, difficult choices, and painful moments that never became part of the main story. By the time Hollywood became interested in Rocky's life, Rusty had already lived through years of doctors, schools, family problems, and the daily reality of raising a child with a rare condition. She knew the difference between the real Rocky and the character people would eventually see on screen. When Mask was released in 1985, many people believed they were finally seeing the true story of Rocky Dennis. But Rusty didn't see it that way. She later described the movie as a fairy tale. That doesn't mean she hated the film. In fact, she had praise for Cher's performance as her. But Rusty had a problem with what Hollywood had done with the story. She believed the movie shifted too much attention toward her instead of Rocky. In her mind, Rocky was supposed to be the center of the story. He was the one who lived with the disease. He was the one who faced people staring at him. He was the one who kept going when doctors believed his life would be short. Yet Hollywood had turned his mother into one of the biggest characters in the story. The irony was hard to miss. Rusty had spent Rocky's childhood fighting against people who wanted to define him by his condition. Then a movie came along and created another version of his life, a version that millions of people would remember. But there was another major change the movie made. It compressed many years of Rocky's life. Events that happened over a long period were presented much closer together. When people watch someone grow up in 2 hours, they see the diagnosis, the school problems, the friendships, the family, and then suddenly reach the end. But Rocky lived those moments over many years. He had ordinary days. He went to school, made friends, had jokes, had interests, had dreams, and had problems that had nothing to do with his disease. That's something a movie can easily lose. When people hear the name Rocky Dennis, many immediately think about his face and his illness. But the real boy was much more than that. He was a teenager who wanted to live. According to the source material, Rocky became an honor student and was known for being friendly and good-natured. He even tutored other students and found ways to make his own place in the world. For Rocky, normal life was something he had to fight for. Every time someone looked at his face and decided what he could or couldn't do, he had another barrier to overcome. Every time a school wanted to place limits on him, his mother pushed back. Every time a doctor gave a frightening prediction, Rocky continued living. That may be the strongest part of his legacy. He didn't prove that his disease wasn't serious. He proved that a serious disease didn't have to become his entire identity. The movie also created a new image of Rusty. Suddenly, people across America knew her as Rocky's wild mother. Cher's performance made Rusty one of the most memorable parts of the film. She was loud, tough, fearless, and lived around bikers. And some of that was real. But there was a danger in that image. People could start remembering Rusty more than Rocky. The mother could become more famous than the son. That wasn't what Rusty wanted. Her story had always been connected to Rocky, but Rocky's life was supposed to be the reason people cared. There was also the matter of the music. Rocky loved Bruce Springsteen. Director Peter Bogdanovich originally built the movie's soundtrack around Springsteen's music, but the studio couldn't reach the required agreement, and the songs were replaced with music by Bob Seger. Rusty was not happy about that change. Music can be part of a person's identity. If Rocky loved Springsteen, then removing that music from his story meant removing another small piece of the real Rocky. Rusty even said she didn't think Rocky knew who Bob Seger was. It sounds almost funny when you hear it alone, but it reveals something important. Rusty was paying attention to the details. She knew her son. She knew what he liked and what he didn't like. When Hollywood changed those details, she noticed. But there was another significant part of the movie that people didn't know about. The movie focused heavily on Rocky and his mother. But Rusty had another son. His name was Joshua. Hollywood left him out completely. Joshua was Rusty's first son, born before Rocky. He was part of the family long before Rocky's story became famous. But when Hollywood created Mask, Joshua was not included in the movie's main story. For Rusty, that was not a small detail. It meant that an important part of her real life had disappeared from the version millions of people were watching. Joshua was living in San Francisco when he was diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma in the mid-1980s. He was also openly gay and had a close relationship with his mother. He later died in 1987 at the age of 32. This changes the way you look at the financial side of the deal. The movie had become a major success, earning more than $48 million at the box office. But Rusty Dennis received only $15,000 for the film rights. Much of that money went toward Joshua's medical bills. Think about that. The story of one son became the way a mother tried to help another son. That's very different from the simple Hollywood idea of a family selling its story for fame. Rusty had already lost so much. She had spent years fighting for Rocky. She had watched him deal with a rare disease that doctors once believed would kill him as a young child. Then, when Rocky finally became the center of a Hollywood movie, another member of her family was facing a serious illness. The movie focused heavily on Rocky and his mother, but Rusty remembered Joshua too. She remembered the years before Rocky. She remembered the family problems. She remembered the real people who stood around them. And she remembered the parts of Rocky's life that Hollywood could not fit into the movie. That's why Rusty's criticism of the film is important. She wasn't simply angry at everyone involved. She could separate the performance from the facts. She could admit when Hollywood got something right. But she also wanted people to understand that the movie was not the complete story. The source material also says the director was unhappy about the music change. Peter Bogdanovich later sued Universal over the soundtrack issue. The original Springsteen music was eventually restored for a later director's cut. So even the music became part of the larger story of how the movie changed Rocky's real life. But none of those changes were as important as what happened near the end of Rocky's life. By 1978, Rocky was 16. He had already lived far longer than doctors originally expected, but the disease was becoming harder to fight. His health had declined. He was using a wheelchair. His headaches had become worse. The boy who had once surprised doctors by surviving childhood was now facing the hardest stage of his life. According to the source material, Rocky went out to dinner with his family and the people around him. Later, he returned home with a headache. Rusty followed the same approach she had used for much of his life and told him to go to his room and make himself well. Rocky went to sleep. He never woke up. He died at home in October 1978. He was 16 years old. But there was another detail that the movie changed. Rusty was not actually at home when Rocky died. She was dealing with a drug possession case at her lawyer's office when she received the call about Rocky. Hollywood changed that moment. Why? Because movies often need a single emotional scene. They need the mother to discover her son. They need the audience to feel the shock at the same time she does. Real life doesn't always give you that kind of scene. Sometimes the phone rings. Sometimes you are somewhere else. Sometimes the final moment happens quietly. And that's what makes Rocky's real story so different. His death was not a dramatic Hollywood ending. It was quiet. He went to sleep, and he did not wake up. For Rusty, that moment ended years of fighting, but it didn't end her story. In some ways, it began another one. After Rocky's death, she had to live with the memories, the movie, the questions, and the public version of her son's life. She also still had Joshua. And as Joshua's health became worse, the meaning of the movie Money became even more painful. Rusty had lost one son. She was trying to help another. The Hollywood story most people knew only showed part of that reality. After Rocky died, Rusty didn't become the quiet, broken mother people might have expected. Instead, she began changing her own life. She moved to San Francisco and became involved with Buddhism. She worked as a counselor helping people dealing with drug addiction. This part of her story is easy to overlook. People often remember Rusty only as the wild biker mother from Mask. But the woman who came after Rocky's death was doing something very different. She was trying to help other people. The same woman who had once lived a chaotic lifestyle was now working with people who were struggling with addiction. That doesn't erase her past. It doesn't make every decision she made correct. But it shows that her life didn't stop with Rocky. She kept moving. She kept changing. And she kept searching for some kind of purpose. The source also says she planned to work with the Shanti Project, an organization connected with helping people who were seriously ill, including AIDS patients. That detail is especially striking when you remember what had happened to Joshua. Rusty had watched illness take both of her sons. Now she was moving toward work that involved helping people facing serious illness themselves. Maybe she wanted to help others because she understood loss. Maybe she wanted to turn some of her pain into something useful. She didn't stop being Rusty. She still rode motorcycles. She still had the same strong personality. But there was another side of her now, a quieter side, a side that had seen more loss than most people could imagine. The source says Rusty also had an unusual way of speaking about death. She reportedly described Rocky's death as another place he had gone, reflecting her refusal to treat death as something that completely erased a person. That attitude tells us something about her. Rusty didn't seem interested in giving people the answer they expected. She didn't offer a clean redemption story. She didn't suddenly become perfect. She remained complicated until the end. For years, Rusty had told Rocky to make himself well when he was hurting. She believed strongly in the power of his mind and attitude. When Rocky died in his sleep, there was no dramatic hospital scene. There were no machines. There was no long final speech. His life simply ended quietly. For Rusty, that may have been one of the hardest things to accept. Yet she didn't publicly frame her philosophy as a failure or describe herself as guilty. She continued to believe that she had given Rocky something important, the ability to see himself as more than a dying boy. That belief may have helped him live as normally as possible. He wasn't constantly told that he was weak. He was pushed to learn. He was pushed to make friends. He was pushed to experience life. When Rocky Dennis became famous through the movie, there was an uncomfortable truth in Rusty's story. She could be fiercely protective and still make choices that people would question. She could be supportive and still have flaws. She could be a strong mother and still be human. That's what makes her story more interesting than a simple hero story. Rusty was not the kind of mother Hollywood usually puts at the center of an inspirational story. She wasn't polished. She didn't live a quiet suburban life. She had a wild past, a strong personality, and a lifestyle that often shocked people. Yet Rocky seemed to benefit from one thing she gave him more than anything else: the belief that he was not helpless. The biggest question was never whether Rocky's life was tragic. It was whether people truly understood what made him special. Rocky had been expected to die as a young child. Instead, he lived to 16. He went to school, made friends, learned new things, and built a life around people who treated him as a person instead of a medical problem. That was the part Rusty wanted people to remember. He didn't prove that his disease wasn't serious. He proved that a serious disease didn't have to become his entire identity. That message is one reason Mask had such an impact. But the movie could only show a small part of it. Real life continued long after the movie ended. For Rusty, there was no perfect Hollywood ending. There was no moment when everything suddenly became okay. Rocky was still gone. Joshua was still facing his own illness. And Rusty still had to wake up every morning and continue living. But she did continue. For nearly 3 decades, she lived with the memories and the movie version of her son's life. Then, in 2006, almost 30 years after Rocky's death, Rusty was involved in a serious motorcycle accident. According to the source, the tire of her 3-wheel motorcycle came off while she was riding. She lost control, hit a curb, and was thrown into a telephone pole. She suffered major injuries, broken legs and a punctured lung, and yet she survived the crash. But an infection followed. On November 11, 2006, Florence Rusty Tullis died at Beverly Hospital in California. She was 70, and even that final chapter seemed to fit the woman people had known. She had spent her life moving. She had lived outside the rules. She had survived family tragedy. She had raised a child who was expected to die young. She had watched Hollywood turn his life into a movie. She had lost both of her sons. She had changed her own life, and she kept riding until she couldn't. There is no perfect ending to Rusty's story. There is no way to make the pain disappear. There is no way to change what happened to Rocky or Joshua. But there is something that remains. The story. Not just the movie. Not just the famous scenes. Not just Cher's performance. The real story. A boy who refused to let his appearance become his identity. A mother who refused to let doctors and schools decide her son's limits. A brother who was left out of the Hollywood version. A family that faced illness, loss, and grief far away from the cameras. Maybe that's what Rusty wanted people to understand. Rocky was never supposed to be remembered only because he looked different. He should be remembered because of what he did with the life he had. He lived. He learned. He made friends. He made people laugh. And he left behind a story that reached millions of people long after he was gone. The movie made his face famous. But the real story gave that face a human being. And once you know the difference, Mask feels very different. You stop seeing only a Hollywood character. You start seeing Rocky, a real boy, a real family, and a life that was far more complicated, painful, and meaningful than any movie could ever show.